Good afternoon from London, and good morning or good evening to all participants, colleagues, friends who are joining from different parts of the world. My name is Brendan Vickers, and I lead the International Trade Policy Team at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And it's my very great pleasure to moderate this session of the Trade and Sustainability Hub. This particular session is jointly organized by the Commonwealth Secretariat, WTO advisors, and the Sridhar Ramphal Center at the University of the West Indies. A very important topic before us today, that of natural disasters, trade policy and trade negotiations, challenges, solutions, and resilience building for small island developing states and others. As we know, small island developing states are on the front lines of climate change. They suffer disproportionately from its effects, especially the growing frequency and intensity of hurricanes or seasonal cyclones. Together with environmental vulnerabilities, there are other structural and non-structural weaknesses that combine to impair their ability to mitigate the devastating consequences of natural disasters and also affect their capacity to recover and build resilience. Indeed, many SIDS are trapped in a vicious cycle of destruction and reconstruction, wiping out decades of development gains. SIDS are perpetually vulnerable to the devastating effects of natural disasters on livelihoods and trading infrastructure. And even within our Commonwealth, our trade ministers have called on our member countries, members of the WTO and the international community to support trade measures that help to alleviate these vulnerabilities and challenges and enable reconstruction and improve the resilience of economies. And even at the WTO, the SVE group has also submitted similar proposals calling for the full flexibility of the multilateral trading system. So certainly the multilateral trading system can indeed play a supportive role to promote SIDS trade and to assist with the three post-disaster phases. That's short-term relief, medium-term recovery, and long-term resilience. So over the next 75 minutes, we will explore ways to mobilize trade and trade policy to mitigate the consequences of natural disasters and ensure the sustainable development of SIDS and others. So to guide us on this journey, we have four excellent speakers joining us on this panel. Clementine Pittar from WTI will look at natural disasters and actual trade-related responses, recovery and resilience in SIDS. We'll then hand over to Hannes Schlumann, also from WTI, who will offer some thoughts on the role of WTO negotiations in improving response, recovery and resilience to natural disasters. Jean-Yves Remy, who's the director of the Sridhar Ramphal Center, will speak about using a vulnerability index for targeted policymaking and how it could possibly apply to existing trade disciplines and designing new ones. And finally, I'll invite my colleague Colin Zwawu from the Commonwealth Secretariat, who will conclude with some observations on alternative development strategies for SIDS and how this could help build resilience. So each speaker will have around 10 minutes. Thereafter, we will open for questions and discussion. I think this is a really critical issue for SIDS and other developing and even some developed countries. So I do encourage you to engage with our panel of speakers. You're welcome to raise questions in the chat or to raise your hand to be called upon. And I'll certainly then recognize you and raise the question. So with that introduction, it's my great pleasure to invite Clementine to start the conversation.
Thank you, Brendan. Hi, everyone. Perfect. I will present you about natural disasters and actual trade-related responses, recovery, and resilience in SIDS. What does the evidence say? So let's take a look at real-life examples. Oh, sorry, I can't switch. Okay, thanks. SIDS, or small island developing states, are mainly from the Caribbean and the Pacific regions, and many of them suffer from regular natural disasters such as tropical cyclones, hurricanes, floods, with dramatic consequences going from death, health issues, the destruction of houses, buildings, crops, to food and water shortage. Many people lose their employment, and obviously the country GDP is greatly affected. Can you switch, please? Countries' reaction to a natural disaster can be described or divided into three phases. The first phase is called the response phase. it happens during or right after the disaster, meaning in the next hours, days following the disaster. The objective of this phase is to meet the population basic needs, meaning providing them with food, water, shelter, basic health care. Then comes the recovery phase in the weeks or months after the disaster, when life hasn't got back to normal, but people's basic needs have been met. For example, people have shelter, but their house still needs to be repaired. The objective of this phase is to get back to some kind of normal life. On the long term, well, actually, the resilience phase makes reference to the long-term reaction of a country to a natural disaster. It can last years. And the aim of this phase is not only to rebuild the country, but to improve its initial conditions so that in the next disaster, it's more resilient. Next, please. Now, in the three phases that I've just described, what can a country do? I will provide you with a few examples of measures that were adopted by SIDS or other countries and can serve as a reference for in case of future natural disasters. Some of these examples are drawn from the recently published WTO studies. They were published in 2019. In the response phase, a country can implement tariff exemptions or reductions in order to increase the imports of relief items and reduce their costs. In Dominica, for example, after Hurricane Maria, they adopted a list of relief items, including food products and construction materials that were exempted from tariff and charges exemption, This can be done perfectly under the WTO framework. And if you need to do that on non-MFN basis, actually, it could be justified by Article 20 of the GATT. A country can also adopt urgent trade facilitation measures to speed the entry of relief items. Namibia, during droughts they suffered from in 2019, requested the notification of food imports in advance of their arrival at the border, and this accelerated customs clearance. Next, please. Facilitating the supply of foreign services can also be very useful just after a disaster, because local supply is unavailable or insufficient, or can also be low-skilled. In Tonga, after the tropical cyclone in 2018, they discovered asbestos in a damaged building, and this obviously needed to be removed. For that, a country needed the intervention of very skilled experts, which implies actually the presence of foreign experts on the ground. These experts need to be able to enter the country easily and quickly, meaning, for example, without lengthy visa procedures. So what you can do in that case is, well, open your market in the relevant sectors, in particular in mode 1 and 4. A country can also provide domestic supports. I think here about food aid to the population or support to the agricultural sector. In Namibia, during the drought, they provided seeds and subsidies to farmers. They facilitated the access to grazing to maintain the livestock. And they provided nutritional support to the population following very strict criteria. These are either green box measures or measures adopted respecting the de minimis level. Next, please. Now, in the medium term, the recovery phase, what happens? Actually, the measures that can be adopted during the recovery phase are similar to measures that can be adopted during the response phase or the resilience phase. a country needs to rebuild itself through the adoption of, implementing better standards, construction standards. This has to do with the build back better principle of the resilience phase. But also a country may need to import construction material with zero tariff, which is a measure that can also be adopted in the response phase. For example, Fiji has an interesting Build Back Safer program. ICT services can also be extremely useful, including the use of tracking software to coordinate, follow rehabilitation and reconstruction activities, as was done in Southeast Asia after the tsunami of 2004. And as trading partners, you can also be of help. You can adopt support measures. After the 2010 floods in Pakistan, the EU requested to the General Council the application of a waiver on customs duties for certain products from there, and it was approved by the General Council. It actually supported the local production and labor. Next, please. Now, in the long term, what can be done? The aim of the resilience phase is actually to anticipate the measures that you could adopt either in the response phase or in the recovery phase. What do I mean? You can improve your current policies and adopt new ones so that when a disaster occurs in the response phase, you don't have to lose time discussing and adopting new policies. You just implement what you planned. For example, you can have a ready import tariff policy in case of emergency, or other types of policies. In Sri Lanka, in Sri Lanka, for example, they adopted new customs procedures, automated customs procedures after the 2004 tsunami. They trained their customs staff on emergency situations. They established a one-stop shop and a list of relief items. They even have a national emergency operation plan. Then having also ready, a next-ante plan to manage unsolicited bilateral donations can also prove essential after a disaster, as it is a challenge in the response phase, actually. That's what Fiji did. They have a specific system to manage UBDs with a national disaster controller who has plenty of power after the disaster. These measures actually are related to the implementation of the trade facilitation agreements. Next, please. Insurance services also determining in the country's capacity to recover and respond and to build resilience after a natural disaster. Because you need payouts to rebuild the country, to help people. In St. Lucia, for example, they have an insurance scheme for low-income individuals that protects them in case of high winds. Now, usually you would need foreign suppliers of insurance services to have more and better services. So what you need to do is to adopt better regulations to comply with international standards, maybe lower the costs, and open your markets regarding the relevant sectors and subsectors. The same could apply to banking services that are necessary to receive cash aid or remittances from the diaspora. Now, let me end with an example related to ICT services of something that happens in East Africa. In Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia, they are using a phone app, a crowdsourcing phone app, to fight against locusts, to try to avoid locust swarm. This app allows the population to identify and localize locusts. Now, the functioning of this app involves a lot of services that can be, it goes from the design of the app to the services of experts working remotely, and the provision of internet services, as you need actually universal service in the country to allow the better functioning of the app. What you can do here is, again, open your market to the relevant sectors, including the telecommunication and communication services sector. Next, please. Let me conclude. I would have loved to give you more examples, but I can't for the sake of time. What we can say is that the WTO has flexibilities and policy space. It doesn't hinder you to adopt any relevant measures, I would say. On the contrary, it's a support for response, recovery, and resilience. Now, there are some challenges and practical considerations that can impair the adoption or the implementation of relevant measures. And we shouldn't forget that seeds have pre-existing conditions that can make it insufficient to only adopt, implement the measures, even the best measures. So all this shows the need to discuss this further at the WTO. Next, please. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Clementine, for raising all those issues. I think particularly useful to highlight the services aspect. You know, when we talk about response, recovery, and relief efforts, you know, we often talking about physical goods, but I think the service is really interesting, and we certainly will come back to these issues in the conversation. I already see there's one question from Ayezu Okoko, and you know, we'll come back to that a bit later. But great pleasure to invite Hannes. Hannes, good to see you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Clementine, for giving us a flavor of what is really in this. There's, as you said, a lot more examples. There are a lot more examples to look at, and I invite all of us to do that because it is highly instructive to get into the juice. In the abstract, and I'm saying this as a trade lawyer, there's often the perspective that is that can be a little bit detached. And once we get into the juice, we realize there's an important thing that needs to happen, which is that we mainstream the idea of disaster awareness in our minds, and I'm meaning our trade policy and trade law minds, in order to really grapple and respond to what is happening here. I want to put another thought into your mind, which is that as much as response, recovery, and resilience can be described as phases, they often happen at the same time. And so we're not really just talking about sequence in time, we're talking about different types of aspects that we need to keep in mind, including the fact that resilience is in some ways a state of affairs. So if my buildings are already more stable than usual, then the disaster will itself be less. So it's not even recovery and or response. It's actually the disaster not happening or partially not happening in the first place. Things like this need a lot of thought. And again, speaking as a trade lawyer, I need to say that relying on exceptions is a way to focus only on disaster as a disaster rather than as a one-off event or as an exceptional event, rather than on disaster as a state of affairs that is closely related to vulnerability. With those introductory remarks, let me try to see whether I can move the slides. I think I cannot, Julie, so you will have to help me. So with that in mind, let us quickly just pause again and ask, before we look for solutions, is there a problem? And Clémentine, that was the right slide. Clémentine already walked us through some of the issues, but I want to invite you again to think, market access, is there a problem? Not really, because we can always unilaterally liberalize. So in that sense, for the disaster affected country to get services and goods, per se, not a problem if we only think of response and immediate recovery. But what if we need to prepare? What if we need to embed this into policy more broadly? But in terms of negotiations, we don't usually have a problem there, although turning it more positive and not defensive for a country that is disaster prone, it may make some sense to build this into its way of making offers in goods and services. So quote unquote, self-commitments that you want to make anyway, which is a general policy advice for trade negotiators, but may just shows that as we mainstream the disaster narrative, we need to start at home, not stop there, but start at home and see how much we can build this into our vision. MFN, Clémentine explained that that is an issue or can be an issue and needs to be overcome. Exceptions can help. I'm not sure they will always help. Thinking of matters where I need to do some creative engineering of where I get my supplies from in a certain moment in order, basically as part of disaster management. So we need to keep an open mind on that one as well. Subsidies were mentioned. Subsidies for SIDS, usually not too much of a problem because it's hard to make such an impact that anyone would care under the WTO system legally and politically. But not all disaster affected countries are in fact SIDS. We need to think of everybody here. Some of them are Commonwealth countries. Pakistan was mentioned, Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. So we need to be aware that the subsidies disciplines, we shouldn't be squeezing the disaster narrative to the sidelines and hoping for the best. We need to have it in our minds and really say, do the rules really do justice to what we need to do here? A particular concern or a particular focus could be on safeguards, special safeguards, because sometimes the situation calls for ad hoc, quick action that would look like a safeguard measure. Clémentine mentioned the unsolicited bilateral donations as one phenomenon where safeguards might be in order. Another one, more broadly, is when you have to do some triage in order to manage all the stuff that is coming to a possibly damaged port. And finally, export restrictions. I think we have Article 11 of the GATT, but I'm not entirely sure whether it's entirely fit for purpose when it comes to, for example, allowing countries to limit their export, to sort of allow certain things to go to a disaster affected country, but not anywhere else while they maintain export restrictions. With that in mind, let me turn over to my next slide and see, ask the question that I'm looking at here. Can WTO negotiations deliver positive impact? Because we want the trade system to deliver to people. And that means in this case, to disaster affected people and other members who might be able to help or might be connected indirectly, directly connected to the disaster country or the disaster affected country. Because it's not just one country, it's often a region, it's also their trading partners, their supply chains, downstream, upstream to be considered. So a disaster doesn't strike one WTO member alone. So there's many that are connected. I will quickly look at 5 new negotiations, if they still qualify as new, and a few traditional negotiations. And the point of the exercise is not to say this or that needs to happen, but to focus on the fact that, on the thesis that I'm proposing here, is that we need to have the disaster narrative mainstreamed in how we do trade policy, and in this case, trade negotiations. So let's move forward with that in mind and look at the next slide. Fishery subsidies. Everybody knows, I suspect in this room, what fishery subsidies negotiations are about. So let me go forward and say the fishery subsidies negotiations deal with illegal, unreported, and what was the second U? Forgot. IUU, illegal fishing. The second discipline relates to overfished stocks, so stocks that are already in a precarious state. And the third discipline, the most general, is relates to overfishing and overcapacity. That's clear as a matter of principle. The details are being negotiated, or perhaps not today, but I hope we move forward shortly. But what if disaster strikes? Well, disaster can strike in multiple different ways. And again, that goes back to the main point. We need to keep a really open mind on everything. But the main focus is on boats being destroyed, harbors being destroyed, gear being destroyed, fishermen being out of work, those things. So here, the main focus is perhaps on rebuilding subsidies, not the only focus. The fishery itself may be affected. The overall context, the trading context may be affected, et cetera, et cetera. But let me focus on the main rebuilding narrative, recovery, if you like, and response. But the recovery and hence rebuilding narrative, the question here is, can I rebuild the boats? Can I give fishermen, can I subsidize the restitution of boats and gear, et cetera? The challenge here is, what if there were a little bit too many boats before, arguably, right? Can I rebuild up to the pre-disaster level, or do I need to stop at a level that is good for fish? That's a social policy versus fish question. I don't want to answer it here, but I just want to say that one can look at this from two different perspectives, and in fact, different drafts in history have done that. The 2021 chair text that we have out there now aims at the status quo ante in relief and recovery. The 2007 text was a bit stricter on that. We need to stop where up to basically the sustainable fisheries level. Maybe in essence, it might amount to much of the same, but I think it's important that we understand how the disaster narrative needs to be accommodated and phased into the negotiations. Resilience measures are more difficult, and I think that goes to the entire narrative, because resilience is something that you do long term. So I would say economists might say, well, that's general industrial policy, a variation of it. So usually the normal tools in WTO law should do the trick. But I'm not entirely sure that's always the case. What I mean to say here is not to judge, but to say we need to watch out for those. So let's quickly move forward. I'm aware of time, maybe not enough. So Brandon, you need to stop me, but let's move forward to the next slide, please. And quickly look at e-commerce and digital trade. Now, I don't want to say much more than what Clementine has already said, but I think for every single phase and every single aspect of it, the more you have, the better it is. I'm simplifying, and I know one can torpedo that particular statement, but in most of the cases, it will be true. If you have government procurement online, if you have e-government generally happening, if you have customs online, if you have easier data transfer, if you have overall provision of services, and to some extent goods, if you want to classify them as such, electronically, that means you are less, if what's in the cloud will not be affected by storms. Okay, that metaphor almost went bad, but that's true. So yes, a server can be affected, but the World Wide Web will not be affected. So the moment you can basically literally come with a backpack with a transmission tower onto an affected island, that moment you're back to normal, and people can actually do their money transactions down to donations. I don't know whether you experienced that, but I made several donations to several crowdsourcing events. People I knew were on the ground in St. Vincent and the Grenadines lately. All of that is e-commerce. So all I mean to say is, without going into details, this is disaster prevention, resilience building, recovery, and response all in one. That doesn't mean we need the WTO discipline. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is a place where we need to keep a good eye on disasters. Let's quickly move forward and just look at 2-3 more. Investment facilitation, let me jump over that. Obviously, investment can help in resilience and all phases really, but resilience building. Investment facilitation can be a component of that, but maybe it's not a main concern here. Let me move forward and just say The same thing applies, next slide, please. The same thing applies to what I will say in a second about MISMEs, but let me stop and pause for a moment on talk about services domestic regulations. Brandon, you stressed the importance of services, and I want to echo that. It is crucial that services can be provided in all these phases, but in particular when speed is of the essence. At that point, good regulatory practice will make all the difference. That's true for goods, that's true for trade facilitation, and services domestic regulation disciplines are really the TFA, the TBT, and the SPS of the services trade. So these disciplines, in whatever form they emerge, and we know now, I hope, that they will emerge now, even though the JSI process has had its question marks, I think services domestic regulation can generate enormous benefits. And that is also true in the context of disasters. Because if you have licensing procedures harmonized, if you have qualifications recognized, if you have electronic documentation recognized, if you can move quickly through the processes so that not only a disaster relief worker, but also a resilience building expert, not necessarily needs to come physically. That's not the point. That can be the point on mode 4, but often the issues are a lot more complex and services need to be provided in all modes of supply. We need to have fluidity as much as possible. Good, so let's quickly just say MISMEs, that's the next slide. The MISMEs narrative is a disaster-related SIDS narrative is by definition a MISME narrative because the companies and players affected will all be MSMEs in almost all of the cases. So whatever we can do to make them stronger, better connected, more resilient, generally will also help with respect to disasters. I will leave it there. One could go into details now, but we don't have the time for that. So let me move forward quickly and just take one quick look at traditional negotiations. Agriculture. Clémentine mentioned public stock holdings. That is the classical disaster prevention or resilience or recovery response preparation measure. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to buy at subsidized prices, but there is a connection between those two. So all I mean to say is this disaster mainstreaming that I'm calling for needs to be part of that narrative, and it is part of that narrative as well. It just shows again that we're touching disaster relatedness all the time. Domestic support was also mentioned. Let me not stop there other than perhaps to say that domestic support sounds from an general economic policy perspective is one issue, but if I'm actually rebuilding or recovering, responding, recovering, or in fact building a resilience in a whole sector, and we're talking about often islands, so the sort of the ability to provide basic supply on the spot it could be an important aspect to resilience. So we're talking about a slightly different framework. Now, the agreement on agriculture does take care of that to some extent, but what I mean to say is here, let's keep it in mind as part of our narrative. Special safeguard mechanism is perhaps the point where we should really say, here is a direct link. I know there are good reasons to question the wisdom of special safeguard mechanisms. I think disasters might give us pause and say, the other reasons that sometimes speak for special safeguards might actually apply specifically in the context of disasters, in particular when it comes to immediate response and short thereafter recovery phases. I don't want to advocate restrictions here, but what I mean to say is SSM as a tool might be a useful one in the context of disaster response. So let's move forward to the next slide and just look at market access for services. Now, as I said, everybody can liberalize as much as they want, so they don't need negotiations to do that. But there is a perspective here that might not be on everybody's mind, which is services export. If you are a disaster affected or disaster prone country, having market access to other markets usually is in order to export goods, but it might also be a way to build a framework, and that applies to both imports and exports of services, a framework that operates almost as a cloud. So you might, if you are operating also in a mode 3 environment, in a mode 3 operation somewhere else, you might be able to shift operations there while your office that has just been destroyed by a tropical storm is being rebuilt at home. So I know that mode 3 is not made for that per se, but it's something to keep in mind, that being networked, including in your own way of doing things, might be something that builds resilience for you as a company, and that means for you as a country as well. And engaging with foreign markets generally increases the ability to ensure continuity, and that means also in the form of services exports. So more back and forth in services is a disaster resilience enhancing measure generally. Let's move forward and say in the area of goods, Clémentine mentioned that we obviously can always reduce tariffs. As I said, that's the same as in services. Sometimes we do have an interest in securing the local production of certain goods. So if we take resilience building as a long-term measure, this is something to be negotiated, as we all know. But as we negotiate goods commitments and as we put pressure in negotiations on countries to liberalize certain goods, we should keep in mind that they may need not just the usual infant industry type of argument, but perhaps a special vulnerability, a special resilience argument to keep certain goods perhaps not liberalized. Again, I'm not saying we should be defensive here, but we should keep this in mind. So let me conclude very quickly by saying we need to conclude basically that WTO rules, existing WTO rules, mostly do not hinder disaster response, recovery, or resilience. But some may, in fact, affect recovery and resilience building. The detour via exceptions and waivers works in reality most of the time, but it may take time, it may create insecurity, and we should just keep an open mind to what we can do about that. Be it to agree on certain interpretations, be it about a safer space where we say, well, in that period, we apply certain flexibilities. I think there is room for creativity here. There is generally a need to take an offensive and creative approach to bringing disaster awareness into WTO negotiation theaters where that is warranted. And I think we need to do that at all points in time, when we build policies, when we negotiate, when we conclude agreements, and when we cooperate in other forms. We need to take full account of related vulnerabilities, and that call really goes to all sides, including to SIDS negotiators, who should keep all those factors in mind as they make their own offers and put on their own demands in negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannes. Sorry, my screen just froze. I think that's been very useful for you just to remind us about the narrative, disaster and disaster-related narrative, and all those issues about mainstreaming and how you ended, that disaster awareness, the open-mindedness about this, and also the vulnerabilities issue you touched on at the end, the related vulnerabilities, which brings us to Jean-Yves Remy. We go from Geneva to the Eastern Caribbean region, a region that is very familiar with natural disasters, particularly hurricanes, and look forward to hearing your views around this topic. Over to you, Jean-Yves.
Thank you so much, Brendan, and the co-organizers who have worked with us in putting on this forum and this platform specifically to look at creative solutions to the problems that are occasioned by climate change and resultant natural disasters that particularly, but not peculiarly affect SIDS. My job in thinking about this issue is to really take advantage of work that has been ongoing on vulnerability. And this is one of the narratives and technical work happening as a tool to assist countries in defining and articulating their special needs as it relates to natural disasters. The idea that we are working with a bit creatively at the SRC, and we started doing some work, is thinking about how that vulnerability metric can be relevant, either in terms of defining the needs or putting forward and articulating, as Hannes was saying, offensive positions in the negotiations at the WTO. So before I get to that sort of second part of my remarks, I want to explain a little bit about the vulnerability index and the vulnerability work that a number of institutions, including the Commonwealth Secretariat, have been working hard on over the past 30 or so years. So outside of formal WTO negotiations, there's been a cry by small developing countries for special attention to their peculiar circumstances. Small states, low-lying countries, and island economies have warned that accelerating climate change and economic uncertainties exacerbate and expose their structural weaknesses and present real impediments to their successful integration into the global economy. So with official development assistance, or ODA, continuously ring-fenced for low-income countries, many middle-income small and island developing states in the Caribbean and the Pacific, especially now battling COVID, find themselves at a breaking point. Although ODA remains a major source of external finance in the aftermath of large natural disasters, many countries have expressed concerns about the way in which ODA is allocated, with only 35 out of 58 SIDS being eligible using the traditional GDP per capita metric for assistance. So GDP per capita is the primary measure of a developmental status, but it denies the majority of small middle-income countries access to international support measures, despite their high levels of vulnerability, and fails to convey their full susceptibility to shocks. So to address the inadequacy of these traditional metrics, many of the international agencies have given credence to the concept of an index as a tool for quantifying countries' vulnerabilities. And these indices have been developed and used by a number of international and even regional development banks, including the World Bank and also other institutions like the Commonwealth Secretariat in the Caribbean, the Caribbean Development Bank, to measure precisely, or as precisely as possible, the extent of a country's vulnerability. The literature so far out there reveals that despite variations across the different works on indices, there are two main areas that are accepted as being part of proxies for measuring vulnerability. One is economic, and for purposes of this discussion, increasingly work is being done on environmental vulnerabilities. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the work being done at the CDB as well as at the Commonwealth Secretariat in giving greater delineation to what economic and environmental vulnerability looks like and why it's so important given the effects of climate change. So the CDB is continuing to work on fine-tuning one of the proxies that it has included in its multidimensional vulnerability index, which looks at climate change as part of a metric looking at a country's susceptibility to natural hazards. Recall that when the CDB conducted its work, it was looking to see how climate change is affecting natural susceptibility to natural disasters by looking at higher frequency and intensity of weather events, including floods, storms, landslides, hurricanes, droughts, which are linked to climate change. These weather events were also linked to depressed economic growth and increased costs for public budgets. Now, there's been a new head of the CDB who wants to continue the work that the CDB has started in looking at climate change as one of the proxies for vulnerability. And in his words, his name is Jean Leon, Dr. Jean Leon, he says that the CDB will continue the work to focus on pre-event vulnerability, the magnitude of impact, and post-event persistence and duration of impact as factors that will also be taken into account in the CDB's multi-dimensional vulnerability index. The second major piece of work that has been advanced in the recent months, I would say, is work that the Commonwealth Secretariat has been doing on a universal vulnerability index, and in particular teasing out those impacts that are related to economic vulnerability that are as a result of climate change, but also physical vulnerability that is happening increasingly because of climate change. And the great novelty, I would say, I'm not an economist, but in the presentations of the new work that I have been fortunate to look at, it seems as if what they're looking at is not just the factors or the proxies that count towards measuring a country's vulnerability, but in addition, also metrics that can actually look at a country's ability to overcome these vulnerabilities and looking at structural features of the country related to resilience. And in its work, it looks at 5 indices: economic and environmental vulnerability, so the impacts on the economy that are occasioned by environmental vulnerability; separately, physical vulnerability to climate change; internal violence; structural resilience; and non-structural resilience. And just not to get too heavy into the weeds, but for our purposes, we really look at the work that the UVI is doing in assessing how a country is able to measure or is able to overcome physical vulnerability that is related to 2 major indicators. One is risks associated with gradual shocks, such as sea level rises, trends in increasing temperatures or decreasing rainfall, and secondly, risks associated with the intensification of recurrent shocks, whether rainfall shocks, temperature shocks, or cyclones. Now, in the overall findings of the UVI paper that came out, the conclusion is that Commonwealth small states are among the most vulnerable when considering vulnerability rankings by vulnerability to climate change or economic vulnerability to external and natural shocks. Alternatively, only a small proportion of those countries rank high in one of the other metrics, which is internal violence index, which leads to an overall conclusion that when you map out and you net out all of these different indices, some of the small vulnerable states in CARICOM, as well as across the Commonwealth, are doing not so badly. This has led to some disagreement about how useful the UVI would be for claims for greater concessional funding, since it does not overall place many of the SIDS that mark high on the vulnerability index in terms of their ability to recover because of their strong structural and their strong governance systems. And so there has been some controversy about whether the UVI is really going to advance the aims of small island developing states in getting added concessional financing, because overall they're doing okay. So all of that background is important, but the question is, what does it really have to do with trade? In a working paper entitled Using a Trade Vulnerability Index to Determine Eligibility for Developing Country Status at the WTO, we at the SRC proposed a trade vulnerability index to advance discussions about how vulnerability can actually be utilized and relevant in a trade context. So we drew in large part on the seminal work that had been done by the CDB. And our work was really in response to the United States attempt to introduce objective criteria for eligibility of S&DT countries, so looking at things like GDP per capita. So we advanced instead this trade vulnerability index to use as a basis for determining whether countries in sector-specific discussions have a higher claim to S&DT than GDP per capita per se, which we found not to be as useful in a trade context. And so we looked at indices relating to the environment, structural as well as institutional indicators. So we have started the work already. What does the new work, the new focus on the CDB and the UVI, how does that assist us in our work looking at how a trade vulnerability index might be relevant? Well, a couple of basic observations can be made in respect of how natural disasters the work on the natural disasters can be further enhanced by the work being done by the Commonwealth Secretariat. Clearly, as a very basic premise, the work of in the UVI that looks at physical vulnerability separately helps to validate the claim that climate change and its impact, whether alone or as part of a broader composite index, is a useful metric for measuring a country's vulnerability. Agreement on how to measure vulnerability is gaining consensus, and the scientific methods for doing so are improving as a result of the identified ways under the UVI for measuring a country's physical vulnerability. The next step, which we have to start thinking more conceptually about, is how would it be relevant in ongoing negotiations? Could it be used to clarify the impact that natural disasters are having both in economic and other terms? What could it add to the general narrative about the need to separately look at how vulnerability impacts countries' trade performance? Small and vulnerable country negotiators have cited difficulties in the negotiations on defining natural disasters and the beneficiaries of a potential specific response. So they're already just in the negotiations facing some pushback in some quarters about what are natural disasters and whether or not they have any impact on a country's ability to overcome its trade obstacles. Not all countries are in favor of the mandate of extending the work of the WTO to natural disasters. I think some of the vulnerability work would be relevant in looking at how it can be studied on its own, but it's also its impact on other metrics under the vulnerability indices. So how is natural disasters particularly unhelpful to countries, for instance, which under the UVI would count as being highly shock vulnerable in terms of their export concentration on a very few number of products and goods like agriculture and tourism? How do these various parts of the index kind of correlate and work together to show how a country's vulnerability may be exacerbated in the face of a natural disaster? Although the WTO is not per se a funding body, and these indices have been developed really in the context of claims for greater assistance by international financial institutions, my suggestion is that the work will also inform how the aid for trade dimension of the WTO can help inform discussions about providing greater technical assistance and grants to countries so that there can be a greater attempt to unlock funding. For instance, those beneficiary countries under the TFA might be able to use the vulnerability index to show how important, in the case of a natural disaster, for instance, the ability to utilize the obligations under the TFA to improve their outcomes, as I think Clementine had mentioned. And the third way I think that is really useful is to look at the work by the UVI, under the UVI, by the Commonwealth Secretariat, not just on vulnerability, but resilience as well. So part of the UVI's construct is that for the first time, we would be looking at structural factors within a country. And when we talk about structural factors, we think about things like human capital, health and education, levels of income per capita, structural market connectivity like transport, ICT and utilities that are really critical in a country's ability to overcome a disaster. And the UVI is useful because it begins to look at whether countries, based on these structural features, are able to nonetheless cope with some of the disadvantages that arise from the physical vulnerability to these natural hazards. So I think it's useful for us to think about how vulnerability, which is really getting a lot of sway, a lot of capital, a lot of political traction, how that might begin to illuminate the discussion at the WTO. It may not lead to hard outcomes at the outset, but it certainly allows, one, a greater evidential base for some of the claims small and vulnerable economies are making. Two, it's not only relevant to small and vulnerable economies because vulnerability in a specific component of the UVI, so for instance, as it relates to countries that face floods or increasing negative outcomes because of climate change, may also, in the context of a specific negotiation, be able to utilize the proxies of the UVI to make a better case evidentially for their demands for special and differential treatment. So I'll stop here and then see in the discussion whether there are any ideas, because we would love ideas on how the UVI and the work being done there may be useful in thinking about some of these issues in a trade context. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you, Shaniv. Particularly like your framing where you said how vulnerability could be used to illuminate discussions at this point. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Colin, but before I do that, I'm just going to alert Hannes to a question that you can start thinking about, Hannes, because I'll come back to you after Colin. It's a question in the chat. The natural disasters is a major feature in climate change. How can the WTO and world leaders leverage the situation through viable means complemented by healthy conventional engineering mechanisms? I thought you'd be good to tackle that one. It has elements of both mitigation and adaptation to climate change and natural disasters. But while we let you think about that, it's my great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Colin. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Brendan. And let me also thank panelists who have spoken before me. One of the disadvantages of being the last speaker is that you've got less time to speak. And I think the advantage might be that you've got, you would have much less to say. And I would like to think there's a balance today in terms of what I'm going to speak and the time given left for me to do so, because much of what has been said has already been, what I was going to say has already been covered by earlier speakers. Can I have the next slide, please, Julie? In kind of a recap, I would just like to maybe summarize what previous speakers have said by noting that, reiterating that feeds face lots of structural challenges to their sustainable development. And they are also geographically isolated, and most of them, some of them have got high poverty levels, and they also have relatively small populations and small markets, and their endowments of land and natural resources are also limited. And they are, like what Shaniv has just said, they're extremely vulnerable to environmental, natural disasters, environmental aspects, and of course, economic shocks. And these countries, like what Brendan said at the start of this event, they are actually exposed at the front line of climate change, which most of them really don't contribute much to. Next slide, please. Because the international community has realized that these countries face these difficulties and challenges, there have been some efforts in the international level to try and support and their development paths. And this started with Agenda 21, when these structural problems were identified as constraining these countries in their development paths. And most recently, we had Samoa Path, which also looked to try and contribute to helping these countries achieve sustainable development, but it hasn't scored much in terms of success because of various reasons, which include insufficient and unaffordable finance, and ODA was also reduced, for instance, from 26.24 billion in 2016 to 4.16 billion in 2018, which means these countries received less resources for that. And if you, Genevieve raised some of these issues in terms of the use of GDP to access finances, which is becoming problematic. And there's also been a slow progress in climate adaptation, and because most of these countries really rely on international support to do so. And there is also one big element, which is in terms of collecting data and analysis for informed policy making and implementation, which is also lacking. As a result, there remains a need for economic development strategies for resilient building to complement the Samoa Path. This is what we undertook to do in our paper, which is on alternative development strategies for seeds, building competitiveness in new industries, because the whole idea was to try and look at areas where there are endowments and where seeds have got a competitive advantage. Next slide, please. In the particular research, we used a simple framework to categorize seeds into economies according to their existing endowments. And we used proxy indicators to help identify the key endowments, inputs, or conditions required to pursue each strategy. And the breakdown is in that slide where you've got manufactured-led industrialization, which is, we looked at labor force, capital stock, and domestic market size. And under natural resource-led industrialization, we broke this down into agriculture commodities variant, where we looked at land. We had extractive commodities variant, which looked at reserves of natural resources, for example, timber or natural gas or minerals. And then we also thought of the new strategy, which is a blue economy variant, which is likely relates to most seeds, and we are looking at the ocean area and coastal distances. And one other development path or strategy we thought we should look at was the service-driven development, which we looked at labor force and access to basic infrastructure. And next slide, please. And what came out of that analysis is that, which is shown in the Venn diagram of suitable seed strategies. And in that Venn diagram, you'll notice that of the 37 seeds in the sample which we used, which excluded Singapore, natural resource-led strategies based on the extensive minerals is most suitable strategy for about 3 seeds, which is Guinea, Bissau, Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste. And none of the countries had enough endowment factors of production to support economic development strategy based on large-scale manufacturing. And none had endowment factors of production to support agricultural products. And you see that 21 seeds suited to service-led development strategies, and 13 seeds identify the suitable mixed strategies. And we have got good examples of mixed strategies in the form of, I think, Mauritius and of course, Singapore. Next slide. Now, we thought that for these particular strategies to be meaningful and to be implemented in a meaningful way, there's always need for international support for them for seeds to succeed in this respect. And the WTO has got a role to play, especially in some areas which can, if positive outcomes are realized, can support seeds in these particular identified strategies. And if you look at the manufacturing-led industrialization, we have got NAMA issues. I think most of these Hannes has covered them. And we've got MIS as well, which if there are positive outcomes, they might support manufacturing-led industrialization, because most of these countries, their economic bases are made of MIS. And then trade and technology transfer is also important to industrialization. We have trade and investment, which Hannes also talked about, and so is e-commerce. And the Small Economies Work Program is also important in this respect, because I think there was work on
I'll show you where to go. Okay.
For next time. Okay. So you come here.
Sorry, there is some talking at the background.
Please continue, Colin. No, I think
I'll continue. Okay, and then if you look at natural resource-led strategy, looking at agriculture negotiations are very important to look at issues of market access, domestic support, export competition, and special safeguards. And I think Hannes also talked about public stock holding, and also what is emerging now with the trade environmental sustainability. I think in trade environmental goods and services is also critical to support some of these strategies. And trade and climate change and natural resources is also important. Next slide, please. If you look at natural resource-led strategies, where you've got the mineral variant, there is also the issues of trade and environment, sustainability, fossil fuel subsidies, environmental goods and services, and CBAM. Those issues have got to be looked into in the context of seeds interests, and trade in climate change and natural resources are also things to focus on. E-commerce comes again, and MIS as well. Services-led development, of course, the whole discussion on trade and services, which has kind of come to a halt, is also important. And of course, services, domestic regulations, which Hannes talked of, and trade, climate, and natural resources. All these elements which are being discussed at the WTO are important. And of course, blue economy, we have talked about plastic pollution, environmental goods and services, fisheries, which Hannes also talked about. So all these elements which are being discussed at the WTO have got a bearing to the success of the strategies which we have identified. And what we would like to think is that there is need for more evidence-based discussion on these issues for seeds to be able to make positions and to be able to extract flexibilities which they can use in terms of building resilience, and in terms of using trade for their growth and sustainable development. So my job was very simple, to try and bring up some alternative areas where we think the WTO can support for building resilience for seeds. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. I think it's probably also really interesting to think about how natural disasters would specifically impact each of those kinds of sectors, as a driver of development. So with that, I think, Hannes, I'd asked you to reflect on the one question. We only have one question in the chat at the moment. I know time has caught up with us, but it's been such a rich and interesting conversation, but perhaps if you'd like to reflect on the question, Hannes.
Yes, thank you so much, Brendan, and thanks, Colin and Jenny for those things. I think the question goes in two directions. The first one is, does this have a lot to do with climate change? The answer is yes, but natural disasters can also be not climate change related. But of course, anything we do to stop or mitigate climate change is disaster prevention. So we should keep that in mind. The climate change joins natural disasters, however, as a theme that I believe trade policymakers, trade negotiators, and trade law interpreters, such as myself, need to rally around. So we need to have these themes being taken seriously. I'd said mainstreamed in order for them to be manifested properly. I think it's time for the trade system to grow up, move beyond the pure trade question. It has already started doing that, of course, and focus on these themes, not in order to solve them alone, but in order to make the contribution it can make. Climate change adaptation measures will often be very similar to resilience building measures that relate to disasters. So that's where the things are connected. I want to refer to two things quickly. One of them is, earlier today, we had a very useful session on the question, is every service an environmental service? And I think that's a good question. And the answer to that is, at least on one or two levels, yes. And I think we need to think of, in that same spirit, about both disasters and climate change. Everything is related, and we need to, without that doesn't solve anything if I say that, but it means that we need to keep an eye on this. We can keep an eye on this. As I said, if we are creative, we stay within the system, no need to rock the system, but there is a way to move forward with those things in mind. The second thing I cannot resist is to point to a session tomorrow afternoon on carbon pricing, the WTO CBAM, and CBAM after COP26. Can we connect the dots? I think that's what we've been trying to do today. We're trying to connect the dots so that really the trade world becomes a better one. Brendan, that's up there.
Thank you, Hannah. Such a really interesting topic. CBAM, the Commonwealth has also done some work around that. I'm happy to share that with you. And then also just a comment in the chat from Motsilisi Matsela, just recognizing the work that's taking place on different indicators and indices and how they can complement each other. And I think that's a call for greater cooperation and dialogue between us all, how we can make that work. We're coming to the end of the session. So I think it is my role to really just thank everyone that's joined us today, our panelists, our participants, the team behind the scenes that have made this possible, to IISD for facilitating this platform. There are many conversations going on around trade, natural disasters, climate change at the WTO, in the CTE, the TESD, at the Commonwealth, in the regions, and I think we need to bring these together. On behalf of all the participants and the panelists, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation, keeping this narrative in mind, that Hannes is reminded of, and illuminating, what vulnerabilities mean for our small island developing states. So on behalf of us all, thank you very much. Goodbye and take care.